Hello, this is Teresa with another video tutorial for Dare to be Artsy. I'm going to be sharing how I created this mixed media background and some new stamps from the newest release from Dare to be Artsy. So I'm going to make my background using a piece of Ranger Distress watercolor paper, and I am using the smooth side of it. I'm using a stencil, a honeycomb stencil, and I believe this one was from Heidi Swap, and I don't think it's available anymore, but just checking online, it looks like there are some other stencils that are similar to this if you want one that looks more like this. I wanted this particular one because it doesn't have the honeycomb all over the background. So I'm using my scrapbook.com blending tools, which are new to me, and adding some Distress Oxide ink and wild honey through the stencil. And I'm just making some spots a little bit darker than others, so I'm not really going for trying to make a very smooth blend with this process. And as you can see, what I've done with the purple tape is I've made myself a hinge so that I could pull the stencil away but not completely away and be able to line it up more easily. Now I'm just pouncing on some of the walnut stained Distress Oxide ink. I'm going to spritz my stencil with some water, and then I'm going to hinge that back over and then press down that ink to try to build in kind of the framework around the little honeycombs. And it kind of sort of worked, so I had to do this, repeat this process a couple more times to get a little more brown ink around. I wasn't going for something that's purple because this is a mixed media style, so I wasn't being particular about making it look absolutely defined. So I'm going to repeat this process again on the bottom to add some additional stenciling area. And it looks like at some point I accidentally put my sponge dauber in the brown ink when I didn't intend to, which made it look overall darker at the bottom. Now, even though that wasn't my intent, it actually ended up looking just fine in the end. So now that I've dried it, I'm going to add a little bit of this crystal glaze, and I'm just adding dots inside the individual openings on this stencil. And once I've done that, I'm going to use my finger to spread it out in each of those areas rather than trying to drag it across with a palette knife or something like that. Again, I'm not worried about perfection as far as it fitting exactly in each and one of these areas. And once I do that, I wanted to see what would happen if I used my heat tool to make it dry faster. And I will zoom in here in a moment so you can see the bubbling up that I'm getting from the crystal glaze. And when I was done drying this, it had a really cool textured effect. So you can see kind of where it's bubbling a little bit as I go over it. This is something that I'd never seen done before, and I just decided to try it and see what happened. So there's the end result of what that looks like. And I wanted to add some splatters on top of this panel, so I just watered down some of the same walnut stained ink. I'm taking a paintbrush and picking up that ink and splattering it all over my panel. And once I get done with that, I will use my heat tool again to dry it, and I'm not going to show that on the screen. But now I'm going to get into the coloring section, and if you want to skip ahead to just slightly past the 8-minute mark, then I'll pick up on where I'm doing a couple of additional things to that background panel and putting the entire card together. But in the meantime, I'll play some music while I'm doing this coloring. now I'm going to work on the sentiment that's already stamped on a piece of Nina Silver White cardstock, and I'm using the Wild Honey Distress Oxide, and I'm just blending that over the top of this piece of cardstock. I will die cut this with a rectangular stitch frame off of the camera, and then I'll come back and make a few more adjustments to it. I'm using the Distress Oxide Vintage Photo again, and I'm just dragging the edges across the ink pad to add a little contrasting color to the edges of my sentiment. And now that that's done, I'm going to go back and do a little more work on the background panel. I'm using my blender brush again, and I'm using the one that I used the walnut stain ink on, and I'm just going around all the edges and concentrating on bringing in some more contrast to the entire frame. I'm adding a little more color to each of the corners. So I'm bringing in some more color further in when I get to each corner, and basically just kind of touching on the edge as I go across the sides and the bottom. And because I'm going to be using a brown piece of cardstock for my card base, I wanted it to be a less dramatic change between the card panel from the card base itself. And since I used a piece of watercolor paper, you can see that it's a bit warped, and therefore I'm going to use some score tape to make sure that I get that to lie nice and flat onto my card base. So I will add 4 strips of score tape at different places on the back of this card front before I attach it to the card. And now that I have 2 of the strips backing paper completely removed, I'm leaving the other 2 partially removed so I can get a little more control over placement on the card panel. And once I'm satisfied with the placement, I'll pull off the rest of the remaining release tape and then press it down against my card base. So now I have that prepared and can start finishing up on the remaining elements. And one of the things I did is add foam tape behind my sentiment, as well as the 2 little bears that I Copic colored, as well as the teeny tiny little bee. And now I'm just figuring out the perfect placement on the card. And then once I get to the little bee, I'll have to pick it up with tweezers because it was just too small to manage otherwise. So now that those are in place, or almost in place, I don't press them down very hard because the foam tape doesn't stick immediately if you don't press it down. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm now picking up the little tiny bee with a pair of tweezers and pressing that into place. And the final embellishment touch I'm putting on there is adding some of the crystal glaze, covering where the honey is dripping out of each of the pots, as well as where it's dripping off the hand on the bear image on the right hand side. So if you want to check out these new release stamps, I will leave links below, and the approximate release date for these will be March 15th. In the meantime, thank you so much for stopping by and watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and until next time, I dare you to get artsy.